Did you know that there is an Army art program? That the Army maintains tens of thousands of pieces of art? What's in the Army art collection, and how can you see it? For answers to these questions and more Army art insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, I'm speaking with Sarah Forgey, the Chief Army Art Curator within the Army Museum Enterprise. We'll be talking about the vast amount of artwork the Army maintains, where the Army gets the art, and why there is an Army art program. Well, welcome, Sarah, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is exciting. This is I've had a chance to walk through where you maintain the art and see a lot of this, so it's unbelievable, and I think our listeners are going to really be interested in this topic.
Excellent. Always a little bit awkward talking about art without having the art in front of us to see, but I'll do the best I can to be descriptive.
Right. And so before we get into the discussion, let me just tell folks who you are. So Sarah Forgey is the Chief Art Curator for the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise. She began working as an assistant curator for the Army Art Collection in 2007 and became its lead curator in 2010. In her current role, Ms. Forgey is the subject matter expert on art for the Army Museum Enterprise, supporting art collecting, exhibitions, and conservation efforts at the Army Museum Enterprise museums and all the museum support centers. I say all, but there's two of them. So
Correct.
Which is where we are right now at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. And then the other one is
Anniston, Alabama. Okay. So although most of the art is stored at the Museum Support Center here at Fort Belvoir.
And so let's just get into it. So Sarah, first and foremost, I know this was a surprise to me when I first started with the Center of Military History that we have an Army art program. Why? What is it about?
That is the question, and I can't tell you how much time I spend at cocktail parties answering that question whenever anybody asks me what I do for a living. The Army Art Collection, we have a ton of artwork. We have about 35,000 pieces maintained by the Army museums and by the museum support centers. And it's a long history. I wasn't aware that we had an Army art collection until I started working for the Army. It's not something that you study in art history programs. So that was a joy to learn about that and to have spent the past 15 years now working with this collection here. I have to get into the history a little bit to start off, just to, explain.
Hey, this is a history podcast.
Exactly,
so that's
yeah.
Perfect.
So we do have a modern program. I'll get to that shortly. Right. But, to understand how we got to where we are, we got to go into the history a little bit. So, the Army has had art and collected art ever since there's been an Army. Soldiers decorated, powder horns and, their bags that they carried as early as, the Revolutionary War. It's a tradition. It goes back in Europe as well as history painters who painted actions that armies and navies, military actions.
Right. So a lot of this art isn't just an artist going out and painting something. Mm-hmm. It's soldiers decorating their items.
It is.
Wow.
So, it's a two-part thing. We have soldiers who decorate things, and we have artists who, either are soldiers themselves or who are civilians and, follow the military and create artwork based on what they're doing. Wow. In the United States, that tradition, it goes back really as early as the Revolutionary War. The earliest works we have in the collection here at Fort Belvoir, the earliest eyewitness works, are some 12 pieces depicting the Mexican War. by an artist named James Walker. Now, James Walker was a trained artist who happened to be in Mexico City during the siege, and he painted what he saw. You know, he was working as a translator, but, you know, since he was trained as an artist, that was what he decided to do. And his artworks are incredibly historically accurate because he was a witness to the events. We still have people contacting us, you know, to view these artworks and see, you know, how were the troops actually positioned. That's how accurate these are.
No kidding. Oh, that's fantastic to know. Wow. And, you know, we're currently in the 175th anniversary of the Mexican War. So one of the things that we're doing as we highlight those campaigns, we're showcasing the Army art. Yes, that you're talking about, so people can see that on our social media. I usually plug that at the end, but I thought this was a good time to bring that in.
Yeah, definitely. We'll keep plugging it here. You know, that tradition continued in the Civil War. Many people know, you know, we talk about Matthew Brady's Civil War photographs. We had artists who were following the armies as well, painting what they saw, publishing them in, you know, Harper's and Leslie's and all the publications of the day. So we have some of those works in our collection as well. But the important distinction in the 19th century is that these artists were working for magazines, they were working for, you know, independent commissions, you know, they were selling their work to people other than the Army. The difference came in the 20th century when the Army started running its own art programs, and that began in World War I.
But why did they transition to that? Why did they want that program?
Well, in some ways, it was because the European armies were doing it, and you know we were joining in the war as it was already occurring, and we decided to do the same thing. There was also really a call within the art community to have artists recording the war and to have artists be involved. So the program for World War I was established, and they chose 8 artists. They commissioned them as captains in the Corps of Engineers, and they sent them all over to France. And their instructions were really kind of revolutionary. They were told, you know, paint what you see. Paint in whatever style, whatever medium you choose. Now, you know, the artists ended up kind of choosing their own specialties. So like we had a couple artists who, you know, chose to paint, you know, more landscape type scenes. We had a couple that chose to focus on, you know, the frontline scenes, and others focused on, you know, machinery, things like that. The artists found that there was a little bit more censorship of their work once it was sent back to Washington than they wanted there to be. So, you know,
censorship in what way?
In that their work wasn't shown to the extent that they wanted it to.
Oh, but not like,
exactly.
Take this
no.
image out.
No, nothing
like
was
that.
changed. Nothing was changed.
It just wasn't shown.
It just wasn't shown to the extent that they expected it to be. So while the program had some really high ideals, it didn't quite meet. It didn't quite live up to it in actuality. Now, those artworks, those World War I artworks, there was no Army art collection at the end of World War I. So those works ended up being turned over to the custody of the Smithsonian, who still maintains them to this day. They showed them a few years ago for the centennial of World War I. The Air and Space Museum had a beautiful exhibit about the World War I artworks. So after World War I, the program was basically disbanded in between the wars. But World War II brought it back with a vengeance. They, you know, kind of the same thing. The art community felt a call to be involved, and artists began designing posters, and there was a big effort to have the illustrators of the day involved in poster design. But a lot of artists really wanted it to go beyond that. They wanted to be there on the front lines, covering the war, just like the previous generation had done during
But
war.
the posters, so what were those recruiting posters?
They're recruiting
Morale?
posters, morale, like the Liberty Loan posters. You know, that's probably the most well-known effort is Liberty Loan posters.
Okay.
You know, both
Yeah,
in
that was a
World
big
War
thing
I
for
and
the
World War
bonds,
II. Yeah.
Okay, the war bonds.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So World War II, the program was even larger than World War I. The War Department, they put together an art advisory committee consisting of, museum curators, artists, George Steinbeck was on the committee. And they chose 42 artists who were among the best artists. Some were very well-known artists of the day. So they chose people, some of whom were already in the Army, some of whom were civilians, and they were given a special commission. 42 of them, and they sent them all over the world to document what the Army was doing at the time.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it was very exciting. The artists were, really into it. A lot of them, they were saying, we're going to go out, we're going to be, we're going to be, doing these great works like Goya or... But then, like many things, funding was cut to the program just a few months into it.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately. So that left us with an issue as far as these artists go. So we had, the artists who were already in the Army were kind of absorbed into their units. They were assigned other duties. Now they were told that they could keep painting and drawing, as long as it didn't conflict with their primary duties. Right. And most of the artists chose to do that. The civilian artists had no commission, and that's when Life magazine stepped in, because they already had artist correspondents in the field and they wanted to expand their program. So they took on the commissions of the civilian artists.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard about the Life art program, but I didn't know the story.
The origin
behind
of
that.
it, yeah.
Oh, that's very
So they all began as Army artists, and then funding was cut, and then they became Life magazine artists.
Good for them.
Yeah, it was. It was a good gig if you could get it, certainly. So those artists, as well, they, Life would give them, their assignment, and the Army or the Navy, whoever they were assigned to, would help them out with transportation, billeting, stuff like that. And many of their works were published in Life magazine during the war. Now, we maintain that collection. Life magazine donated it to the DoD in 1960. And the Army was luckily assigned the job of maintaining the entire collection. So, beautiful works that depict Navy, Marine Corps, the Marine Corps Peleliu Landing paintings by Tom Lee. These are iconic works. But they're maintained by the Army. The Marines are a little sore about that. We do, we're happy to loan them to the Marine Corps Museum.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it's more than just Army collection. It's military art.
Yeah, the Life collection
primarily
in particular.
Army.
The Life collection in particular has works from the other services, but the rest of our collection is primarily Army. Okay. If we were offered works related to another service, we would offer them to the art collection of the other service. Okay. But the Life collection was donated to the DoD with the stipulation it has to all stay together. We don't want 60 pieces going here, 100 going here. We want it all to stay together. So we maintain custody and we loan it as needed. So that was the Life collection. That was donated to us in 1960. Meanwhile, we've still got those soldier artists out in the field during World War II. And some of them were really aggressive about getting to the front lines in order to, we had one particular artist, Rudolf von Ripper, who would kind of, go up to the front lines and he'd disappear for weeks or months at a time. No one would hear from him. And they'd be like, what is going on with this guy? I wonder where he is. And then he'd show up, just randomly with a bunch of artworks, leave them off, and then go disappear again.
Well, what would they do? So they're out there, I'm sure they have a weapon with them, and they're out there with troops. But they wouldn't just sit there and set up a tripod and start painting. So
it depends on the artist. So, they had to carry their own materials. And this is true to this day as well. Right. So generally they're carrying stuff that they can easily fit in, that they can easily carry. Okay. So they're working, rather than working in like oil paints on canvas, most of them are working on paper. They're working, with pen, with graphite pencils. They're working with watercolors. But they're also facing issues as well. Sometimes if you're working in really hot conditions, really cold conditions, your art materials may not work as well as you expect them to. We had one artist, Edward Reap, who he liked to paint in watercolor, but he was covering the Italian campaign, and it was too cold in the winter that his watercolors would freeze before they adhere to the paper. So when you look at his work, it's, depending on the time of year, it's watercolor, watercolor, watercolor. Then he switched to just ink over the winter of the Italian campaign.
Could he go back later and?
Oh, absolutely,
and update it with the watercolor?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's
so I would
the
imagine
artist's
a lot
choice.
of these guys sketch stuff initially, and then turn it into a bigger piece of art.
Yeah, and that's the artist's choice. Some of our artists, like to, kind of take sketches when they're out in the field. They kind of as a form of note taking, and then they go back to their studio, and turn it into a more finished artwork.
Do you have any of the sketchbooks?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah, we do. And those are my particular favorite treasures in the collection. It's like reading a diary entry, but in visual form.
Wow.
Because it's so immediate. You can see exactly what was going on. You can see the mistakes that the artist made. You can see when he or she. I say he because we're talking about World War II, and at the time it was just men in the World War II program. But we have had female artists in the more modern program. You can see when the artist has made mistakes or changed his mind, or you can see the little notes that they take. Just to remind themselves later, this is so and so. And this is what was going on. I love those little notes. As a curator, you live by that stuff, like something that the artist jots down if you can read it. As long as you can read the notes, you can. That's the stuff that you dig into. And who was this soldier? What else can I find out about him? Right. And that goes into your exhibit labels and your cataloging records and everything. It's fascinating. So World War II was a very active time period for the Army art program. We had those artists in the field. We also had Yank Magazine had artists. Yank Magazine, the enlisted man's magazine, had a lot of artists who, some of them were doing the same thing, going out into the field, creating documentary artwork, and some of them were doing cartoons. Now, we have a huge collection of Yank Magazine material as well. It's about 3,000 pieces. So that is some really neat material.
Those are a lot of cartoons as well?
A lot of it's cartoons, yeah. Some are funny, some aren't. Some are products of their time, and, they would be offensive to a modern audience. But, they're interesting in that they are products of the time. They're a glimpse into what the enlisted man was experiencing during the time.
Yeah. And then moving forward, and we did the same thing. Now, after World War II, did the art program go away, or is it now firmly established?
It is firmly established now. Right after World War II, it did go away. But remember, after World War I, we gave the art to the Smithsonian. Yeah. Well, after World War II, we had way more art. We had about 3,000 works of art that were turned in by those soldier artists who were in the field. We had the Yank collection. The Army's just accumulating art at this point, and they don't really know what to do with it. So that's when they established an Army art collection. Right. So at that point, they started formally collecting soldier artwork, gathering it together, codifying the program to the extent that they could in 1946. Right. In the Korean War, there was an effort to get a similar program going, but it never really took off. So we have not very good coverage of the Korean War. Now, there were a couple artists, one working for Stars and Stripes. There was an artist who was a Department of Defense civilian, and he was over there, and he had some art training, and he recognized that we didn't have an art program, so somebody should do it. So he created some artworks. But because we didn't have a formal program in the Korean War, that is an area that we don't have a lot of artwork covering.
And then, like, Life magazine didn't see an interest?
They didn't, no. Stars and Stripes did. I think Collier's had a Korean War program as well, but no, Life magazine did not. The Vietnam War was when the next really big Army art program effort took off. Once we got into Vietnam, we established a program through the Army Arts and Crafts program. And that was what they did this time was kind of cool. They put together teams of artists. So, for the World War I artists, it was World War I and World War II, it was a rather solitary experience.
Right.
You would have a group. But when you go out into the field, you're on your own. So they learned from that, and they decided to put the artists together into teams so that everybody has their, artist battle buddy. And so they put together teams of artists, and this was something that that they drew from active duty soldiers. So some were draftees, some had volunteered. And these people, they kind of advertised for it, and people applied. They sent in a portfolio of their work, and they were selected for the team. So over the course of the Vietnam War, we had 9 teams of artists. Each team had 4 to 5 people on it. There was, an officer who was always chosen as the supervisor, and 3 or 4 enlisted men. And they would.
That's pretty sizable.
Yeah, it was a pretty sizable teams, and they would have enough that if they needed to send 2 people on one mission today and 2 people on a different mission, they could cover both. But in general, the teams traveled together. They would deploy to Vietnam for 90 days per team. And while they were there, they didn't stay with a particular unit. They usually went around and covered, they might cover one unit for, a couple weeks and then go someplace else and what's going on over here. They just tried to get out and, talk to soldiers and, take photographs, because at this point they're all carrying a camera. World War II, they were not necessarily carrying cameras.
And that could almost be their sketch, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
So
some of them sketched anyway, and we do have some amazing Vietnam era sketchbooks. But some chose to take pictures using cameras and use that as their reference material. So then after 90 days in country, the entire team, picked up and they went to a studio together. And they spent about 90 days in the studio taking their sketches, their photographs, their notes, and turning them into finished paintings. Wow. So from the Vietnam era, we have more works on canvas because they had that time in the studio.
Okay, right.
World War II, everybody was turning in what they could carry. So we don't have a lot of works on canvas. We have a lot of, watercolors and sketches, stuff like that.
And then when did the Army Artist in Residence program begin?
That began in 1993. That was established. So after the Vietnam War, we kept that team of artists scenario going, and we would have generally 1 team a year, maybe 2 teams a year, covering whatever the Army was doing. So we sent teams of artists all over the world documenting what the Army was doing throughout the 1970s, 1980s as well. That continued up until the Persian Gulf War. And at that point, knowing that we were deploying soldiers, they got a team of artists together. They sent 1 team over to cover Operation Desert Shield. And then we sent another team to cover Operation Desert Storm. Now, they didn't get there in time to actually see the action, but they got to cover a lot of, the administration program missed those couple of days. Yeah, the bureaucracy did not keep up with the couple of days of action. But, they were there in time to, to see the aftermath. They talked to the soldiers who participated. They were able to create artworks based on it. So after those two teams of artists got back, they had an exhibit of their artwork that was at the Old Guard Museum up in Arlington, Virginia. And that exhibit was attended by the Chief of Staff of the Army, who at the time was General Gordon Sullivan. And he was very, very impressed with those artists' work. And, he met them, he talked to them. He was so impressed with what they were doing that he established the Army Artist Program, which, that created a permanent position on our staff here at the Center of Military History for an active duty artist.
So it's 1 artist.
1 artist, yep. So since 1993, we've had 1 artist at any time.
1 at a time, okay. Now I have to ask this question that comes up. So we have an artist, but why is it relevant to have an artist today when we have? I could see in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, you need paintings, you need drawings, so people understood what it looked like and what soldiers' life was and all those things. But now we have cameras, we have video cameras, we have drones, we've got all this now. So why do we still maintain or need an Army art
That is
program?
the second most often question that I'm asked. The second most asked question. It's another way of documenting. It's bringing somebody else's personal vision into documentation. So, if your document, I don't want to imply that photography can't be fine art, because it certainly can. But if you're a photographer for the U.S. Army, you're doing documentary photography. And, what you snap with your photo, you're not going back, you're not changing it, to make it look more artistic.
Right.
Your photograph is your documentation. If you're an Army artist, you can use a little more artistic license. You can, and by that I don't mean lie. I mean, you can take different aspects of a scene that may not be within the frame of the camera. So, you're the artist, and you've spent 2 weeks hanging out with this unit and watching what they do. And, something interesting happens, yesterday, something interesting happens tomorrow, something interesting happens on different days. You can take parts of those scenes and incorporate them all into one interesting painting.
It's a slice of life.
It is a slice of life, yeah. And an artist is able to, use that artistic license and, take little pieces and put them together, synthesize them into one scene.
All right. Well, that makes sense. I definitely understand that.
Yeah, and each artist that you ask will have their own perspective on, why his or her job is important and why his or her job differs drastically from what the photographers do.
Right. Now, this art collection. So over time, you've collected up, you said, about 35,000 pieces of art. And they're stored mainly here at Fort Belvoir.
We have about 16,000 pieces at Fort Belvoir. Okay. There is a large collection at the West Point Museum. In general, the West Point Museum's collection is very heavy on 19th century, very strong on 19th century. And the collection here at Fort Belvoir is very strong on 20th century. So the two collections really complement one another very well in that way. And then the rest of it is all over at the different Army museums. So, artworks that, are related to military police might be on display at the Military Police Museum, or infantry pieces at the National Infantry Museum.
Now, I've been into a lot of government offices here we're recording in the Washington, D.C. area, but also when I was on active duty, around the world, I would see artwork, but my understanding is those weren't the originals.
Yes, we have. Fortunately, we have the technology to make really, really high quality reproductions. And generally, people looking at them, you often can't tell that you're looking at a reproduction versus an original painting. And that's great because it allows us to keep the originals in a museum environment to ensure their preservation, while at the same time putting the artwork out there in somebody's office or, in a hallway, conference room, et cetera, and allowing, the Army and, the American people who see them to enjoy those works and learn from them.
And there are a lot of them out there, and people may not realize it, but if you start paying attention, to what's hanging up in the walls and the offices and things, and it's
any Army building you walk into, you will probably see works from our collection on the walls.
Right. Yeah, and most likely reproductions.
Yes.
And then the National Museum of the U.S. Army, the new museum that opened up near, right next to Fort Belvoir here. So they showcase your art as well, so people can go there and see it.
Yes, they did. The inaugural exhibit in their temporary gallery was titled The Art of Soldiering, and that was I actually curated that exhibit, and it was an excellent opportunity to showcase our artwork and, to show some of the best pieces from the soldier art, from the soldier artists, from the, the civilian war correspondents, as well as pieces that, are decorated by soldiers.
Right.
So that was something that we did with that exhibit is, we had a Humvee door that a soldier decorated.
I love first the exhibit was amazing.
Thank you.
It really was, and the artwork. I was just blown away by the quality of the artwork and how it just pulls you in, and it feels like you're there. It
does, yeah, and that's the best thing, the most amazing thing that this art collection does, and that exhibiting it does is that it can bring together generations of soldiers. Yeah. So, you could visit that exhibit with soldiers of, 4 different generations, and they will all find common experiences. Yeah. That's what's so cool about the artwork is that, you have somebody who served in, World War II, Vietnam, GWAT, and they'll all look at a work of art and they'll find a common experience there. But it's timeless.
It is. I think the slice of life, the soldier experience, looking at that artwork, if it was from the 18th century or, up recently to the modern wars that we've been in, you're seeing soldiers experience the same things in some ways.
Yeah,
the chow lines,
Yep.
the cleaning of the weapons, the weapons may have changed and stuff, but still soldiering is soldiering.
Soldiering is soldiering, and that's one thing that we wanted to do in that exhibit is get that timelessness of it across.
And as you mentioned earlier, the thing that fascinated me, I think the most that I learned from that experience is the artwork isn't just the paintings. It's like you're saying, the door of the Humvee, what is it? The canvas bags. People would paint on their canvas bags or draw. So
yeah, and it's doodling, but it's also it's also a window into the experience of the soldiers and the time in which they served. So
soldiers who didn't set out to be an artist. If they've got something like that,
anyone who is
may
listening,
have a hidden treasure.
If you have something that you have doodled, we might be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you do more than just collect the art here, right? So you have this vast art collection, but it's got to be maintained, or what's the term? Curated, or?
Curating is generally what you do when you're putting together an exhibit. We research, we write on it, but preserving is I think the word that you're looking for here, and. That is always a balancing act. As museum professionals, we want to get that artwork out there. We want people to see it. We want people to learn from it. But we're also thinking about its long-term preservation. And when I say that, I'm not talking about 10 years from now. I'm talking about, is this object that is made of things that naturally degrade, is this object going to be around 50 years from now, 200 years from now, 400 years from now? And, everything that we do is made with our decisions are made with that in mind. So our facility is kept at a particular temperature, particular humidity. We have very, very high quality air filtration in this building and in most of our museum buildings in order to maintain the best environment possible for the artifacts.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. Yeah. So a lot of time and effort has been paid to maintaining or preserving, as you said.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And getting things ready to go on exhibit as well. Artwork, unless you work in a museum, you probably think, well, it's an artwork, you just hang it on the wall. Yeah. No, we need to, because we're thinking about preserving it until the end of time. Right. We need to think about the light levels. We need to think about, what is gravity going to do to this painting if we hang it for a certain length of time? And gravity's bad.
And for a lot of the reasons that we've already stated through this, it's the Army's heritage.
It is the Army's heritage.
It's the Army's story. And that's why I think it's so important.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that it's around for future generations and as well as enjoyed by and, here to teach current generations.
Now, you've already talked about a few significant pieces, but what are other significant pieces of art that you maintain?
Well, that Life collection of artwork is fantastic. I mentioned
That's World War II.
The World War II. Yes, I mentioned Tom Lee's Peleliu Landing series. That includes a very well-known work called Marines Call It That 2,000-Yard Stare. Sorry, yes. Marine Corps, we do have it.
Yeah.
That is one of the works that everybody wants to see. We have 4 Norman Rockwell originals in the collection.
He made those for the Army or about Army
For
life?
the Army, yes. So one of them is, the famous machine gunner piece. It's titled "Let's Give Him Enough and on Time."
Oh yes, okay.
So that's one that we'll put that one up on the social media Fridays.
Okay. Yeah.
The Yank cartoons, and even the works by the soldier artists. These are, they're significant works because they mean something to soldiers, and because soldiers can look at them, and as I was saying a few minutes ago, because soldiers of various generations all relate to that same experience.
And how can people see the Army art? You mentioned that there's museums, but there's other ways.
The best way to go see works in person is to visit one of the Army museums. Most of them have at least 1 or 2 artworks up at any given time. The National Museum of the U.S. Army just took down the Art of Soldiering exhibit, but there will be a smaller version of it reopening when they reopen that gallery.
Okay.
Later on this summer. I think it's September that it's reopening. So there will still be artwork up there. In addition to that, we have artwork up on the CMH website. We have Army Art Fridays that we have on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Right.
And also in the Army History magazine. A couple times a year we have an Army art article. So
So people can explore the website at history.army.mil. And as I put together the social media posts for Army Art Friday, that's one of the places that we go, in addition to the art that you and your team send me as well. So there's a lot of places people can go to find the Army art.
Yeah, we also have a couple hard copy publications as well.
Yes.
There are, and they're available on our website as well. There's one on Army Art Vietnam to the present day that's titled In the Line of Duty. There's a couple that were published in the 1990s. Those are titled I can't remember.
Yeah. So before we get to Who Trivia, is there anything else that we didn't bring up that you think is important for people to know about the art program?
No, I don't think so, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions that you get on the podcast.
All right, well, we'll do. So thanks so much. But before we close, it's time for my favorite segment called Whoa Trivia. All right, so this is a piece of significant Army trivia, something that we're hoping will impress or wow the audience. So what piece of Whoa Trivia can you share about the Army Art Program?
All right, so we were just talking about significant pieces of art that the Army maintains, but I was saving this for Whoa Trivia.
Okay, good.
Now, did you know that Walt Disney designed both nose art and insignia during World War II?
So that's the Walt Disney.
The Walt Disney, yes.
So wait, first of all, nose art. What do you mean by that? What's nose art?
Nose art for airplanes.
For airplanes. So the front of the airplanes.
Front of the airplanes.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Now most of those are maintained by Disney and protected under copyright, but we do have 2 pieces in our collection. Works on paper that were Walt Disney's designs.
Oh wow.
So, and those are currently at our Transportation Museum and Aviation Museum. They, because they're works on paper, they're not constantly on display, but they do sometimes rotate onto display.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, great, because Disney, the Disney studios, the artists, the filmmakers, they did a lot for the war effort.
Yes, they did.
And, so that's really cool. Well, great. I didn't know that they were involved in the art program too, so that's fascinating. Well, thank you so much for that Whoa Trivia. And thanks so much for your discussion and insights today about the Army Art Program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Army Art Program or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And from the website, you could also find Army museums near you if you want to go and visit some of these to see the art. Just click on the museum tab at the top of the website. You can explore that and our Army art pages as well. And if you want to experience Army history every day, as we were talking about, you can visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So please join us every week on this podcast for more in-depth discussions as we cover topics from all eras of U.S. Army history examining battles, soldier experiences, equipment, weapons, and tactics. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.